She wasn't supposed to be there when it happened. Nobody ever is. The elevator doors parted on the 42nd floor of Hallberg Global's Manhattan Tower at 4:47 in the morning, and Zara Kincaid pushed her cleaning cart into the hallway without making a sound. The wheels didn't squeak. She had oiled them herself. 3 months ago, she figured out that squeaky wheels got people noticed in places like this, and she couldn't afford to be noticed. Not yet. The hallway smelled like money. That was the only way to describe it, that cold, pressurized scent that only existed above the 30th floor. Leather, fresh paint, air that somebody paid a lot to keep clean. The kind of air that makes you aware, before you even look around, that you are somewhere you were hired to serve but never invited to belong. Zara pulled her left earbud out and let the language podcast run low in the right one. Yoruba tonight. She was working through a tonal shift in a specific coastal dialect. One that changed meaning entirely depending on where the weight fell in a 3-syllable phrase. Her lips moved as she listened, barely, just enough to fix the sound in her memory. She had been doing this since she was 9 years old. Languages were the one thing that had never cost her anything but attention. And attention she had always had in full supply. Hi viewers, have you ever hidden a skill so deep inside yourself that the world just walked right past it? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to read every single one. She stopped at the far end of the hallway outside the executive conference room. The one internally called the Diamond Suite. A name she'd seen in a group email she was never supposed to have access to, printed on a work order left in the copy room. The door was propped open by a cleaning wedge someone from the day shift had forgotten. Amber light spilled into the hallway. Someone had been in there working late. She could see the evidence. Coffee cups still holding warmth, a digital whiteboard still active, presentation notes spread across the mahogany table like they'd been pulled apart in a hurry and then abandoned mid-thought. The Italian marble floor reflected everything back in polished silence. Her own face looked up at her from the surface. Tired, steady, careful. She always looked careful at 4 a.m. Careful was the only expression that felt safe in a building like this. The $2,000 espresso machine on the sideboard blinked its standby light at her. Patient. Indifferent. It cost more than 2 months of her take-home pay, and it had never once been operated by the people who cleaned it. Zara moved inside and began stacking cups. Standard procedure. She worked efficiently, without wasted movement, the way someone works when their body knows a task so well the mind can operate somewhere else entirely. That was when she heard it. Not from the vent. From the adjoining room, the smaller conference space that connected through a door she hadn't noticed was cracked open 2 inches. Voices. Low and deliberate. Someone rehearsing. Or briefing. Or arguing in the careful way that professional people argue, with soft tones and hard words. She wasn't trying to listen, but one phrase cut through everything. A phrase in a Ghanaian dialect. Old. Specific. Something she recognized the way you recognize a song from childhood. Not from memory, but from somewhere deeper than that. From the part of you that was formed before you knew you were being formed. She went completely still, because the voice that came next, a different voice, polished, confident, American accented, rendered that phrase as something it absolutely was not. Not even close. Not a little wrong. The kind of wrong that had consequences. The kind of wrong that changes what a room full of powerful people decides to do next. Zara set the coffee cup down without a sound. Down the hall, the overnight security guard, Deshaun Lattimore, 26, always had a podcast running of his own. Past the conference room doorway on his standard loop. He glanced in, saw Zara standing motionless in the center of the room, both earbuds out, head angled slightly toward the cracked connecting door. He knew that look. She got it sometimes, like she was somewhere else while standing exactly where she was. 2 months back, he'd caught her correcting a Spanish translation error on a vendor signage form that had gone out to building management. She'd done it quietly on a sticky note, without explanation. He'd said, "You sound like Google Translate sometimes, Kincaid." She'd smiled, said nothing, kept working. She smiled at a lot of things and said nothing. 11 months in this building, and that had been the safest way to move through it. But right now, standing in the Diamond Suite at 53 in the morning with a mistranslated Ghanaian proverb echoing in her chest. Zara was not smiling. She was listening, and thinking, and doing the kind of quiet math that people do when they're measuring a risk they didn't ask to be handed. The building PA clicked on. Soft and institutional. Executive Conference Room A has been designated for priority use beginning at 6 a.m. All cleaning personnel, please complete service and clear the floor by 5:45. Then her radio. Her shift manager's voice, no preamble. Zara, you're confirmed on the 42nd. Full suite needs to be cleared and set. Big acquisition meeting this morning, 20 translators flying in. CEOs in the room. Be out by 5:45, no exceptions. 20 translators. She looked at the cracked connecting door. The dialect reached her again, clearer this time, unmistakable in its structure. And she froze, because she knew exactly which hybrid dialect it was. She knew its roots, its register, its weight. She knew what the phrase they had just mistranslated was actually demanding. And she knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from textbooks, that if that phrase walked into a room full of international executives and landed wrong, it wouldn't just be a failed negotiation. It would be an insult that crossed generations. She stood there with her mop handle in one hand and a stack of used coffee cups in the other. And she had a decision to make. The room was already full by 6:10 a.m. 20 translators. 12 nations represented. For lead interpreters positioned at the main table, 16 more seated along the perimeter wall with tablets and earpieces and credentials that had taken decades to earn. Every one of them in dark suits. Every one of them carrying themselves the way people carry themselves when they've been told they are the most qualified in the room. Callum Rowe stood at the head of the table and let them settle. He did not sit. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who had long ago discovered that stillness is a kind of pressure, that if you stay very still in a room full of movement, people start to feel the difference. His weight was evenly placed, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes tracking the room in a way that appeared casual and was anything but. He was 41. Built his first company at 24, lost it at 27, rebuilt from the foundation at 30, and hadn't looked back since. He had a reputation in deal rooms for three things: patience, precision, and the unnerving ability to know when someone in the room was performing confidence rather than carrying it. He did not raise his voice, ever. He lowered it, and people leaned in. That was the control. Chief Ambassador Kofi Asante-Mensah sat directly across from the Hallberg legal team. He had flown overnight from Accra with 2 senior advisors. He was 63 years old and wore his authority the way men of his generation wore their best cloth, as a matter of dignity, not display. He had been in negotiation rooms longer than some of the people in this one had been alive. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was going to do it at his own pace. The lead translator, a man named Preston Alcott, Georgetown linguistics, 15 years of international field experience, genuinely excellent in 2-language families, opened the session cleanly. His phrasing was precise, his cadence appropriate. For the first 8 minutes, everything held. Then Ambassador Asante-Mensah shifted in his chair slightly. A small thing, almost invisible, and he began to speak in a hybrid dialect. A living fusion of formal Twi and a regional coastal variant that had evolved in a specific province over 3 generations. It wasn't widely documented. It wasn't taught. It existed in the mouths of people who had grown up near it. Preston hesitated. Half a second. 1 breath. Almost nothing. But Callum saw it. The second interpreter leaned toward Preston and whispered something behind a cupped hand. Preston shook his head slightly and continued. But what he delivered was textbook. Academic. Technically structured and emotionally evacuated. It captured the surface of the ambassador's words and missed everything underneath. Ambassador Asante-Mensah finished. Folded his hands on the table. Waited. Preston translated. The ambassador wishes to proceed in a spirit of mutual goodwill and notes the importance of honoring prior agreements between our peoples. Clean. Respectful. Wrong. What the ambassador had actually spoken contained a proverb, old, coastal, painfully specific. About the vine that grows so heavy it breaks the branch that holds it. It was not a greeting. It was not an expression of goodwill. It was a condition, a ceiling, a line drawn in silk so fine the other side might not see it until they had already crossed it. Outside the glass conference wall, in the hallway, on her knees beside the baseboard trim she'd been tasked to finish before the floor cleared, Zara Kincaid had not left. The clock read 6:14. No one had come to move her along. She heard the translation. Her hand stopped on the cloth. She pressed her lips together, told herself this was not her room, not her table, not her negotiation, told herself to finish the baseboard and get to the elevator and not make this her problem. Then the ambassador spoke again. Same dialect, slower, more deliberate, and this time the phrase he used wasn't a condition. It was beyond a condition. It was a statement about what happens when trust is extended and then extracted. It referenced, obliquely but unmistakably, the history of agreements that had taken from one party while appearing to benefit both. Preston translated it as, "The ambassador emphasizes the historical relationship between our two communities." Zara's mouth opened slightly. "No," she whispered, barely a sound, more breath than voice. The word came out before she could catch it, but the glass wall carried it. Callum Rowe's head turned. Slow, deliberate. The turn of someone who heard something and chose to track it rather than dismiss it. His eyes found the hallway, found the woman in the cleaning uniform still kneeling at the baseboard with a cloth in her hand and an expression on her face that did not match the task she was doing. He did not move, did not speak. Then, quiet as a door closing in an empty room. Who just said that? Nobody answered him right away. That 3-second pause expanded like pressure in a sealed space. Chairs shifted slightly. Eyes moved without heads moving. The kind of collective stillness that happens when a room full of professionals suddenly isn't sure who has authority over the next moment. Then a junior translator near the door glanced out into the hallway, saw Zara, looked back at the table with an expression that tried to be neutral. "I believe it was the cleaning staff, sir." Callum didn't look away from the glass wall. "Bring her in." Marcus, his assistant, stepped into the hallway and spoke to her in a low, careful voice. The voice of someone who had learned how to deliver unexpected instructions without creating scenes. "Ma'am, he'd like you to come inside." Zara stood up from the floor. She did not rush. She set the cloth over the rim of the bucket. She straightened her uniform. She walked through the conference room door with her hands at her sides and her expression giving away nothing at all. 20 people looked at her. She looked at the ambassador. Dr. Elena Voss, Oxford-trained, for heads of state on her translation resume, positioned near the center of the perimeter wall, said what the room was collectively thinking, and said it with the kind of controlled firmness that comes from years of being the most credentialed person in the room. "We have this handled." Zara didn't look at her. She looked at Callum Rowe. He was watching her with that careful, unhurried attention she would come to recognize as his default mode. The look of a man who had made a great deal of money by waiting for people to reveal what they actually were before he decided what to do about it. "What did you say?" he asked her. She took one breath. Even. No performance in it. The proverb the ambassador used, the second one, it doesn't translate the way it was rendered. Her voice stayed low. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just precise. It's a reference to what happens when a guest consumes the foundation of the host's house. Not the relationship between communities. The cost of extraction. He's setting a ceiling before the contract language even enters the room. Silence settled hard. "It comes from a coastal proverb about the tree and the vine," she continued, because the room needed the context and she could see that. "The vine that grows too heavy collapses the branch it lives on." He is saying, if the terms of this agreement strip the resource base, there will be nothing left to negotiate over in the future. That is the meaning. That is what was said. Preston stared at the table. Callum said, "What's the subtext?" She had already answered that, but she understood what he was actually asking. He was testing whether she knew the difference between knowing something and understanding why it mattered. "The subtext is a condition," she said. "He is not expressing goodwill." He is stating the terms under which goodwill can exist. He drew a line. And right now, this room doesn't know that line was drawn. The silence that followed had weight. Then Ambassador Asante Mensah spoke. Same dialect. Slower and more deliberate than before. The pace of a man who had decided to test whether the room had just gotten smarter. Zara let the full sentence form before she opened her mouth. Her father had drilled that into her from the time she was old enough to hold a pencil. Never chase the words. Chase the intention. The words are just the vehicle. Wait for the road. She translated. Clean. Precise. No decoration. No editorializing. Just the meaning, complete and exactly placed. The ambassador's senior advisor turned and looked at Asante Mensah. The ambassador gave a small nod. Almost imperceptible. The nod of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he had walking into the building. That was the only confirmation Callum needed. He held Zara's gaze for a moment. Then he turned to his legal lead and said something too low for the room to catch, and the session continued. No one told her to sit. No one told her to leave. She stood near the wall the way she had stood in hallways for 11 months. Present, contained, taking up as little space as possible while seeing everything. 2 exchanges later, when a coalition advisor interjected in a different register. Formal, clipped, carrying a shade of displeasure that the words themselves didn't announce. Zara caught the shift before the credential team did. She translated without being asked. Callum didn't look surprised. He redirected the table's attention toward what she'd said and kept the session moving, as smoothly as if the handoff had been planned. Dr. Voss did not look at Zara again for the remainder of the session. What hurt most wasn't the dismissal. It wasn't the way 2 of the perimeter translators stopped making eye contact with her after the second exchange. It wasn't even the fact that she was standing in the same uniform she mopped floors in. It was how fast it happened, how quickly a room full of educated, credentialed, well-traveled people adjusted their idea of what she was capable of, while never once adjusting their idea of what she was. She had been in this building for 11 months. 11 months. And not one person had ever asked her name. Then the coalition leader shifted forward in his chair. And when he spoke this time, the dialect changed entirely. The room stiffened. Preston's pen stopped. 2 translators exchanged looks. One reached for a tablet. Another leaned toward the person beside them with an expression that was trying very hard not to look like panic. Zara's expression did not change. But something behind her eyes did. Because she recognized it. She didn't move for a full second. She stood near the wall while the room quietly came apart at the edges. Translators pulling up databases, Preston pressing his earpiece like that would help. 2 perimeter interpreters trading whispers in voices too low to carry. The kind of controlled scramble that tries very hard to look like it isn't happening. In rooms like this, falling apart publicly costs too much. So it happened in the margins. Callum noticed. He always noticed. He had built his entire operating method on noticing the things that rooms were trying to hide. He didn't look at his translation team. He looked at Zara. Not urgently. Not dramatically. He looked at her the way you look at a door you've seen 100 times and are only now considering that you've never actually opened it. She met his gaze. Gave the smallest nod. He directed the next exchange through her. No announcement. No explanation to the room. He simply asked the ambassador's advisor to continue, and when the advisor did, Callum turned his body a degree toward Zara. Just enough to make the direction clear. She translated. The dialect was Creole, a Creole language rooted in West Africa, carried by the diaspora, alive and dense and layered in ways that a textbook gives you the shape of, without ever giving you the weight. It ran fast when the speaker was pressing a point they needed the other side to genuinely feel, and it ran with a particular kind of music that told you as much about emotional register as any individual word. Zara had learned it from recordings, not classrooms, from her father's cassette archive, 17 years of fieldwork captured on tapes he'd made as a UN contract interpreter and then brought home at the end of each posting like luggage. She had listened to those tapes as a child the way other children listened to the radio. Not always understanding, but absorbing. The way children absorb language before they know that's what they're doing. She translated 2 full consecutive exchanges. Fluid, unhurried, exact. The ambassador's senior advisor watched her with an attention that was different from how the rest of the room was watching her. Less surprised. More evaluative. Like someone running a quiet calculation. Then Dr. Elena Voss stood up. This is highly irregular. Her voice was calibrated, not raised. The voice of someone who had made careers out of being the most credentialed presence in the room and knew exactly how to use that to close a door. We have a process in place. A vetted, contracted process. And inserting an unverified. The process had a gap, Callum said. He didn't look up from the table when he said it. Did not raise his voice. Did not look at Dr. Voss with anything close to confrontation. He simply stated it the way you state something that is finished. And then he said, without transition, continue. He was speaking to Zara. Dr. Voss sat down. The session ran another 43 minutes. The credential team handled the structured technical exchanges, the numbers, the timelines, the legal language. But any time the ambassador's register shifted, any time the dialect layered, any time the room sensed the difference between what was being said and what was being meant, Callum's eyes moved to Zara. She did not overspeak. That was the thing he kept noticing. Most people handed that kind of room and that kind of moment would fill every gap, would expand into all available space, would perform the expertise they'd just been handed an audience for. She did not do that. She waited until she was needed. She read the room's shifts the way someone who has spent years being invisible in rooms learns to read them, completely quietly, from the perimeter. She translated when translation was required and said nothing when it wasn't. She never repeated herself. She never explained herself. She was the most precise person in a room full of people whose entire careers were built on precision. When the session adjourned at 8:22 a.m., Zara reached for her cloth. Started toward the door. Wait, Callum. One word. Lo. She turned. The room was still clearing around them. Advisors gathering documents. Translators collecting their bags with expressions ranging from professionally neutral to something Zara had learned to recognize as wounded pride. He stood at the head of the table with his hands in his pockets. Unhurried. Like the morning had been entirely ordinary. Where did you learn that? He asked. She had a version of this answer she'd constructed carefully over the years. The version that was true but incomplete. The version that gave enough without giving everything. From listening, she said. To what? Podcasts. Language programs. I've been doing it since I was a kid. He watched her face while she said it. Not like he was looking for a lie. More like he was measuring the distance between what she'd said and what she hadn't. No formal training? No formal degree, she said. Not in this. Another pause. He nodded slowly, filing something. Be available tomorrow, he said, and turned back to his documents. She picked up her cart and walked it toward the service elevator. The hallway was quiet. Her footsteps made no sound on the marble. She was almost to the service door when she remembered the conference room light. She had not turned it off. She went back. The room was empty now. Just the residual warmth of 20 people and a negotiation that had gone differently than anyone expected. She crossed to the light panel. On the far corner of the mahogany table, face down, slightly overlapping the edge, was a single sheet of paper. Left behind. She picked it up to stack with the other documents. She turned it over. Internal memo. Date stamped 3 weeks ago. Marked for board-level distribution. She read it once. Then she read it again. The translation vendor contract. The one billing Hallberg Global at $4,200 per session, per the rate sheet attached, had been awarded through a subsidiary. The subsidiary was owned by a board member's brother-in-law. The memo referred to the arrangement as a preferred vendor relationship and cited the team's academic credentials and international reach as justification for the rate. Academic credentials. The same credentials that had just collapsed in front of a West African coalition leader because nobody had taken the time to match the team to the actual dialect. Zara set the memo back exactly where she found it. Face down. Edge aligned. She turned off the light and walked out. It wasn't an accident. She kept trying to give it that exit. On the bus home, during the 4 hours of fractured sleep she allowed herself before her next shift. Washing her hands in the break room the following evening while 2 coworkers talked about something that had nothing to do with any of this. She kept handing the whole thing the benefit of the doubt and watching it refuse to take it. Because the more she turned it over, the cleaner it looked. And clean was the problem. Accidents have rough edges. They leave fingerprints. They produce the kind of chaos that doesn't fully resolve. The vendor, the contract, the assignment of a Western credential team to a negotiation requiring field-specific dialect knowledge. This was smooth. This was a system that had been built to function in a particular direction, and it had functioned exactly that way. The translators weren't incompetent. That was the part she kept landing on. Preston Alcott was genuinely good. She had listened to him work for nearly an hour, and she knew the difference between a professional who can't do the work and a professional who has been handed the wrong task. Preston had Georgetown on his wall and real skill in his hands, and he had been placed in a room that required something his training had never touched. That wasn't his failure. That was a decision someone else made. And that decision had a paper trail. She had held it in her hands for 30 seconds in an empty conference room. By the 3rd day, she stopped calling it an accident. She was back on the 42nd floor on the 4th morning. Her shift manager had relayed Callum's instruction without comment. Her access to Conference Suite A was to be maintained until further notice. The manager had read the message to her twice, evenly, in the tone of someone delivering information they didn't fully understand and had chosen not to question. Zara had nodded and said she understood. Callum was already inside the suite when she arrived. Alone. Just him, a black coffee, and a closed laptop sitting in front of a chair he hadn't sat in yet. He looked like a man who had been in the room long enough to have already thought through several versions of this conversation. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from him, at the table, not near the wall, not by the door. Directly across from him at the mahogany surface she had wiped down 24 times in 11 months without ever having been invited to put her hands flat on top of it. She sat. She put her hands flat on the table. "The session this week," Callum said. "The translation failures from before you intervened." He paused just briefly, the pause of a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "Were they that bad?" He was watching her face as much as he was waiting for her answer. She understood what the question actually was. He wasn't asking her to evaluate the translator's capabilities. He was asking whether she believed the failure had been structural or manufactured. He was asking her to say something out loud that would confirm or deny what he had already started to suspect. She took a beat. "They weren't prepared for this dialect," she said. 3 seconds of silence. "That's all?" he said. "That's what I observed," she said. She did not say, "The vendor contract runs through a subsidiary that belongs to someone on your board." She did not say, "The rate is inflated by roughly 40% above market, and the gap gets wider every time a secondary specialist has to be brought in to cover what the primary team can't reach." She did not say, "This has the shape of something that was designed to perpetuate itself." She gave him the truth in the smallest package that was still the truth. Because she had learned, somewhere in the long education of being underestimated, that the most useful thing you can do with a man who already suspects the answer is not give him everything. Give him the part that shows you know what you're looking at. Let him do the rest. He studied her reaction more than her words. She let him. "The vendor contract," he said, just those 3 words. Like a question that had decided not to be a question. She held his gaze, said nothing. "Is there anything you want to add to that?" "I think you've already seen what you need to see," she said. "This is how power hides. Not in loud corruption. Not in the kind of drama that gets documented and prosecuted and turned into headlines. In quiet contracts. In assignment decisions. In the gap between what a vendor promises and what the situation actually requires. A gap that generates its own revenue every single time it opens." She had seen this kind of system operate before in smaller rooms for smaller amounts. It always looked like incompetence from the outside. It never actually was. Callum picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking, looked at the table for a moment. "I'll need you available for the follow-up session next week," he said. "I'll be here." He nodded. She stood. "Kincaid." She turned. "You're careful with what you say." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't entirely a compliment either. It was an observation delivered with the particular neutrality of someone deciding how much to trust it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. "Good," he said, and turned back to the table. She was at the end of the hallway, near the service exit, when Marcus caught up to her. He was moving quickly in the way people move when they're carrying information they know is significant and haven't yet decided what to do with. "He called an audit this morning," Marcus said, keeping his voice low and even. "Internal compliance. Before you got here. Before anyone else was on the floor." He paused. "He didn't route it through the board." Zara kept walking. "He didn't tell anyone," Marcus added, like that part needed to be said clearly. She pushed through the service door and let it close behind her. She stood in the stairwell for a moment, just standing, listening to the building breathe. The audit would find what it was going to find. The numbers would surface. The contract structure would be visible to anyone who looked at it with clear eyes and the intention to look. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was what someone on that board was going to do when they felt the floor start to move. And whether, when that happened, Zara Kincaid's name would be the first one they reached for. Word traveled fast in a building that size. Not loudly. Not in announcements. It moved the way things always move in corporate towers, through looks, through pauses, through the way a conversation stops right when you walk into a break room, before you can hear what was being said. That was the particular skill of powerful institutions. They communicated everything important without ever writing it down. By Thursday, Zara felt it every time she stepped off the elevator. 2 executive assistants who used to nod at her stopped making eye contact. A senior project manager turned his back when she passed him near the coffee station. A woman from the legal department who had borrowed her phone charger 3 weeks ago walked straight past her without recognition. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The message was in the small things, the deliberate coolness, the way a group of people can tell you without a single word that you've done something they haven't forgiven you for. She had translated. That was all she had done. And somehow that was enough to make her a problem in a building she had been cleaning for 11 months without anyone noticing her at all. On Friday morning, pushing her cart toward the service elevator, Dr. Elena Voss stepped out of a conference room directly in front of her. Not by accident. Dr. Voss had the posture of someone who had decided exactly how this moment would go before she arrived for it. She looked at Zara with a kind of cold precision that is more cutting than any raised voice. "You embarrassed professionals," she said. Low, deliberate. The words landed with the particular sharpness of someone who had rehearsed them. Zara stopped the cart. She let the words land fully, did not deflect them, did not shrink from them. She did not reach for an apology. She did not explain herself. She gave the response exactly the weight it deserved. "I translated," she said. 2 words. Factual. Nothing added. Dr. Voss held her gaze for 3 full seconds, the count of someone deciding whether to press further or accept the draw. Then she turned and walked back the way she came, heels precise on the marble. Zara pushed the cart forward and did not replay the conversation once. She had learned long ago that replaying confrontations was a tax paid entirely to people who would never know you had paid it. She had enough real expenses in her life without adding invisible ones. The following Monday, Marcus found her before her shift. "He's requesting your presence at the 2nd negotiation session. Tuesday, 8 a.m. Suite A. Officially this time. That one word, officially, changed the shape of everything that came after it. Tuesday, she was shown to a seat at the table. Not the perimeter wall. Not the hallway floor outside the glass. The table. 3rd chair from the head, left side, with a legal pad and a pen already placed in front of her like someone had thought carefully about where she should sit before she ever arrived. 2 board members were present. One of them, Garrison Webb, silver-haired, practicing ease the way certain men practice it for decades until it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. Looked at the seat Zara was walking toward, then looked at Callum. An unspoken question. Callum did not respond to it. He opened the session. When the coalition leader referenced the long history of foreign entities entering African agreements and extracting far more than they contributed, Zara translated it completely. Every word, without softening a single syllable. The room went still. Webb's jaw tightened. Callum didn't move. And in that stillness, that moment where no one in the room took a breath, Zara understood for the first time exactly how much danger her accuracy had placed her in. The words were already in the air. She could not pull them back. She did not try. What the ambassador had said, delivered in the measured, weighted cadence of a man who had carried old grievances into a new room and decided this was the day to name them, was a direct reference. To contracts, to extraction, to agreements that read like partnership on paper and operate like something else entirely once the ink is dry and the foreign delegation has flown home and the people left behind are holding terms they never fully agreed to. He had spoken in dialect. Dense, layered, specific in ways that only someone who had lived close to the language for years would catch the full meaning of. Zara had rendered it in plain American English. Every syllable. Without flinching, without inserting a buffer, without the small professional cushion that someone protecting their own position would have added automatically. The room did not explode. Compressed. Garrison Webb leaned back slowly in his chair. The Hallberg legal lead stopped writing mid-sentence and did not pick his pen back up. Two of the ambassador's advisors exchanged a look that was not surprise. It was recognition. The look of people who had been waiting across multiple rooms and multiple cities to find out if the table across from them was honest enough to actually hear what was being said to it. Callum had not moved. He was looking at the table, not at any one face, just the surface, the way you study something when you are deciding what to build on it next. The session paused. The ambassador's senior advisor leaned close and spoke quietly. The ambassador nodded once and sat back. Then Callum looked at Zara, no instruction, no question. Just hold. She held. After the session cleared, Callum asked everyone except Zara and his general counsel Elliot Draper to step out. He waited for the door to close. "Why didn't you soften it?" he asked. "Because they weren't speaking softly," she said. A pause. "That's going to cost something," he said. Not a warning. An honest observation. "It was already costing something," she said. "It was costing accuracy. Every session." He nodded once. In the hallway afterward, she passed Garrison Webb going the opposite direction. He didn't stop. He looked at her the way people look at something they are already calculating the cost of removing. She kept walking. That afternoon, the audit results landed on Callum's desk. She didn't know that yet. She was on a lower floor running a standard cleaning shift, Swahili moving low in her left ear, hands working through motions her body had memorized months ago. Marcus told her the next morning, near the stairwell door, voice low. The compliance team had flagged 3 separate contracts. Millions misallocated across 2 full fiscal years. The vendor arrangement. The inflated billing structure. The gap between what the original contract promised and what the sessions had actually delivered. Every thread, pulled carefully, led back to the same name. Garrison Webb. True intelligence is not about pleasing power. It is about respecting the truth even when the room is not ready to hear it. Zara had translated what needed to be translated. She had told the truth in the only language she had. And now the walls of this building were about to feel what that cost. The board meeting was 3 days away, and nobody had told Zara what was coming. They didn't have to. She could already feel the floor beginning to shift beneath her feet. Slow, structural, the way things shift when the pressure underneath has finally exceeded what they were built to hold. She recognized that feeling. She had felt versions of it before in smaller rooms over smaller amounts. She went home that night, made tea, opened her language files and waited. Because waiting, patient, clear-eyed, fully prepared waiting, was the one thing she had always known how to do. She went back to cleaning. That's the part nobody tells you about stories like this one. The waiting, the return to ordinary. The way you go from being the most important voice in a room full of powerful people to being completely invisible again, inside the same 12 hours without any transition, as if the morning had never happened. Tuesday she sat at the table. Wednesday she was wiping down the espresso machine on the 38th floor. Nobody sent her a message. Nobody came to explain what happened next. She showed up for her shifts, did her work, kept her earbuds in, and waited the way someone waits when they can feel that something is moving underneath everything but cannot yet see which direction it's going. The building felt different now. Webb's assistant, Celeste, always efficient, moved through the executive hallways with the barely controlled energy of someone managing something that keeps trying to become a problem. Fast steps, careful eyes, slightly too aware of who was around her. 2 vendor contacts appeared in the lobby on Thursday afternoon. Unscheduled. Deshawn noticed from the security desk and mentioned it to Zara without looking up from his log. "Something is shifting up there," he said. She nodded, kept moving. Friday evening, Callum called her directly. Her personal cell, which she had given to exactly 4 people in her life, and which she had never once expected to ring with this area code. His voice on the line was the same voice he used at the boardroom table. Measured, unhurried, carrying no performance of any kind. "The audit is complete," he said. She waited. She had learned that with him, waiting was the right response. He said what he meant and he said it without prompting. "There's going to be a board meeting Monday. Standard quarterly format from the outside. Something different on the inside." A pause. Intentional. "If things change as a result of that meeting, and they will, what do you want?" She sat with the question. It was the most direct thing he had said to her across 3 weeks of conversations that were always careful and never fully open. She did not answer quickly. She took the full weight of it. "Recognition for the expertise," she said. "Not rescue." 3 seconds of complete quiet on the line. "That's a specific thing to ask for," he said. "It's a specific situation," she said. He said he'd be in touch. The call ended. She set the phone down on the break room table and looked at it for a moment without picking it up again. Recognition for expertise, not rescue. She had held that line in her own head since the morning she walked into that conference room. She did not want to become the story someone told about the maid who saved the deal. She wanted to be seen as the person who knew what she knew, completely credibly, and had simply been wearing the wrong uniform for reasons that had nothing at all to do with her ability. The weekend passed. Mandarin on Saturday, Portuguese on Sunday. The languages steady the way they had always been. Monday. She arrived at 4:30 a.m. The building was quiet the way it was always quiet at that hour. Held breath, low hum from the HVAC system, security lights casting the marble in amber. Board meeting at 9 a.m. By 8:45 she was on the 41st floor, 1 level below the boardroom, running a cloth along a baseboard she had already cleaned 2 days before. She wasn't there because it needed cleaning. She was there because she needed to be in the building. Close, present, because this was her story too, even if no one had officially told her that yet. At 9:03, footsteps moved overhead toward conference room A. She kept cleaning. Because that was what she did while the world made its decisions. The only real question now was whether this time, this specific morning, the world was actually deciding something new, or just rearranging the same furniture in the same room and calling it progress. The board expected an expansion discussion. That was the agenda they had received. Standard quarterly review. Q3 performance. International acquisition progress. Q4 projections. Callum's meetings ran tight and on point. Nobody had reason to expect anything different. He let them settle. Coffee poured. Pleasantries exchanged. The low, comfortable hum of people who believe they understand the shape of the next 2 hours. Then Callum opened a folder. Printed documents, physical paper, not a presentation slide. The kind of choice that tells a room this is not a conversation to be managed. It is a record. He began with the audit findings. No introduction. No context setting. Just the numbers, read in sequence, with the precision of someone who had chosen every word carefully over an entire weekend. Vendor contract awarded without competitive bidding. subsidiary ownership connected to a board member's immediate family, billing rates running 38% above market standard, service delivery failing to meet the dialect and regional requirements documented in the original acquisition brief, the requirements that had been there in writing from the beginning. Estimated misallocation across 2 fiscal years, $4.3 million. The room held its breath. Garrison Webb sat at the far end of the table. His face did not change. Men who had operated at his level for decades had learned to perform composure the same way seasoned actors do. Steady expression, relaxed hands, eyes that do not dart to the exits. He was performing it now with precision. But he did not speak. Not once. Not a rebuttal, not a question, not even a request for clarification on a single line. And that silence, in a room where Garrison Webb had never once gone quiet when something of his was on the line, was the loudest thing in the building. 40 minutes in, he slid a single folded sheet across the table toward the board chair. He stood without making eye contact with anyone. Walked out. The door closed behind him with no drama, no final statement. The exit of a man who had run the numbers and understood that the result was permanent. There was no recovering this room. There never would be. Callum waited 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Then he continued as if the chair at the end of the table had always been empty. He proposed a new internal division, cultural intelligence and linguistic risk. A dedicated team reporting directly to the CEO. Responsible for dialect matching, cultural context review, and full negotiation support across all international acquisitions going forward. Approved in 11 minutes. The director of this division will report directly to me, Callum said. A pause. Deliberate. Zara Kincaid. Silence pressed down on the room. Someone at the far end asked, Is she currently in the building? She is, Callum said. Marcus took the elevator down 1 floor. He found Zara exactly where she had been for the past hour. Kneeling at a baseboard on the 41st floor, cloth moving in slow, steady circles, earbuds in, completely unhurried. He crouched beside her. They need you upstairs, he said. Now. She looked at him. She did not ask what for. She stood, removed her earbuds, straightened her uniform. She rode up 1 floor in the same clothes she had worn every morning for 11 months. Walked through the boardroom door, and stood at the threshold. 20 faces turned toward her. Callum looked at her from the head of the table. Even, certain, effective immediately, he said. Your role changes. No applause, no ceremony. Just the quiet, necessary reordering of things that had been in the wrong position for far too long. And then, from the far end of the table, came the question she had been waiting for since she walked in. What happens to the others? She asked for 2 things before she agreed to a single detail. First, no public naming of the translators. No internal announcements that singled out individual failure. They had been placed in the wrong room with the wrong tools by a system designed to put them there. That was not their error to carry publicly. She was not interested in making human examples out of a decision that had been made above their heads. Second, a retraining program, built properly this time, matched to actual field requirements, not academic pedigree. Available to every contractor who had worked under the old vendor arrangement and wanted to continue working with Hallberg in the new structure. Callum agreed without a single counter. Elliot Draper looked at her afterward with something she recognized as genuine curiosity. You want to protect the people who doubted you, he said. I want to fix the system that put all of us in the wrong positions, she said. That is not the same thing. He wrote it into the framework without another word. 6 weeks later, Zara Kincaid sat in a corner office on the 42nd floor, 2 rooms down from the Diamond Suite. The city spread wide and silver beneath her window, the same city she had moved through before sunrise for almost a year, from a completely different angle. She wore a navy suit, tailored. She had paid for it herself on a Tuesday afternoon, at a store she had walked past 100 times without going in. That detail mattered to her more than she could fully explain. It just did. Her team was 4 people to start. Amani, raised between Lagos and Brooklyn, 6 languages, no formal degree, the fastest contextual thinker Zara had encountered in her professional life. She had found Amani through a community language network, not a recruiter. Darius, 8 years of field interpretation across East and Central Africa, the kind of experience that settles into your instincts rather than your resume. 2 researchers who understood, genuinely understood, the difference between what linguistics looks like typed on a page and what it sounds like when it is alive and moving and under pressure in a real room with real consequences attached to every word. The onboarding document she built was not a manual. It was a philosophy written in plain language. Match the team to the terrain. Credential is not the same as capability. A negotiation is only as honest as the translation running through it. And translation is only as honest as the person doing it is free to be. The West African Coalition deal closed 14 days after the board meeting. The ambassador's official statement of confidence contained a phrase buried near the end. Zara caught it the moment the document was forwarded to her. The vine and the branch. The same proverb that had started all of this 9 months earlier, in a hallway at 4:53 in the morning. Used now not as a warning but as a signal. Commitment. The right terms had held, and both sides knew it. 3 months in, a journalist contacted Hallberg about a piece on cultural competency in international acquisitions. How did the new division start? Communications went to Callum. Callum asked Zara. She took a day. Then, tell her it started with a gap between what the company needed and what the system was delivering. And when someone identified that gap clearly enough, the company chose to fix it. The story ran. It named the division. It named the director. It never mentioned the uniform. Nobody outside those walls ever learned how it began. And Zara, sitting in that corner office on a quiet Tuesday evening, the city fading below her, earbuds in, working through a new dialect, understood that this was always the better story. Not the maid who shocked the billionaire. The woman who had always known exactly what she knew. Who carried it through 11 months of being unseen without letting it shrink. Who walked through the door when it finally opened. Both hands steady, nothing to prove. Delayed justice does not announce itself. It simply arrives. And when it does, the transformation runs so complete that humiliation was never necessary. Because real transformation does not need an audience. The most powerful voice in the room had been there all along. She just had not been asked yet. If the story moved something in you, if you have ever been the most capable person in the room and still been looked past, drop your thoughts in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built for the person still waiting for the room to notice them. Do not miss what is coming next.